I figure this is a good point to mention it, but I'm also going to be having a call with Deadbolt Doris, aka Alex Lee. You know, the Twitter guy. Deadbolt. You guys know this guy. He's the writer that posts a lot of like Runeterra stuff. And yeah. Today, actually, I think in like a couple hours from now, I'll ask why Rumble's bad. You know, cancel the call. So I mean, I think that'll be a lot of fun. So yeah. For those of you guys who don't know, as I mentioned, this was gonna be a pretty casual Q&A. You know, nothing too crazy. We're just gonna go ahead and kind of just chat about the game. I had some curiosities that I wanted to find out about, just in terms of. I mean, I guess like it's hard to cover like a narrow range of topics, but initially I was just thinking along the lines of just like the general philosophy of things coming out, like how you guys are feeling about certain metagames, and a lot of things about, like, for example, the balance patches are definitely a common note. Obviously, we got the big hot fix yesterday, so I would be curious. Those kinds of topics would be like how things might look moving forward. But first, I mean, do you want to introduce yourself? Kind of like talk about who you are, where people might know you from.
Yeah. So, yep, I'm Alex Lee. I've been on Legends of Runeterra since kind of the beginning. So some stuff I've done is I worked on like the original tutorials and challenges. Set lead for Rising Tides. I've done a bunch of other random work, and then most recently was design lead for all of Bandle City stuff.
Oh,
And then live design person at the moment as well.
that's really cool. I didn't actually know that you were the set lead for the Rising Tides.
Yeah, feels like forever. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, people probably also know you from like Twitter. You're very active, like talking about like the thoughts. I think there was one time a couple of weeks ago, or maybe like a couple of months ago, where you guys were kind of like polling community opinions for like ideas and suggestions.
Yep, yeah, that's me. Yeah, I generally try to use Twitter as much as I can just to get an understanding of like how people are feeling about stuff. It's been, I think, anecdotally for me at least, been pretty valuable in terms of like gut checking. You know what people's thoughts are on various cards, or just how they're feeling about things. Or in the case of that thread, like hearing about weird decks that people like to play, or like cards that they have a huge affinity for.
Yeah.
All that stuff is like awesome.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess just like to get right into it, and this is gonna be like fairly free form. Like, I'm not like too prepared, more of a casual conversation. But I wanted to hear about just like how the process of like balance patching and hot fixing works. Right? There's been a lot of talk. There was at one point people were saying like why where are the balance, like where are the 2 week balance changes that we used to have. And people were saying that it's kind of like hard because the process of submitting balance changes through the mobile store client or whatever, I don't know exactly what it was, but some kind of like limitation on the back end that was preventing more frequent ones. Like, how does that work, and has that process changed throughout the time?
Yeah. So there's a couple things there. I think the first one to kind of get past the tech stuff is like, yep, submitting to mobile stuff requires more lead time than just patching it to live. Like if our game was only PC, we can kind of push those changes, not for free, but like it's much easier.
Right.
Mobile does take a little more time. Um, that being said, like we did used to do the 2 week time or patches. The reality with the 2 week patches was we just didn't have enough time to get the level of data where we could uh, understand what kind of change we need to make and then make a change that felt impactful. I was watching your stream yesterday on when you were kind of looking at old patches, and there was a common thread between a lot of those, which is we had to generally revert or change the same card multiple times.
Yes.
When we were on that 2 week patch kind of time period, what would happen is patch drops. We get the first week to get as much data as we can, and then we get the next half of the week to try and figure out what changes are likely to do the right job. And what that ended up being is we would do an okay job at fixing the problem like right now, but that usually resulted in like problems in the future.
More
I think
problems, yeah.
Bilgewater, yeah, right. Like nerfing Make It Rain is the classic example for us of like we did that and it made sense for the time period, but Bilgewater was just like kind of off the map for a while because they didn't have any baseline tools that they needed. And so like that stuff aside, it was also just like very stressful.
Sure.
Steve Ruman was the one that was kind of captaining that team at the time, and like living in that cycle doesn't give you much time to do anything else, including like work on other stuff. And so that's kind of like the history of that. Since then, we kind of identified like, hey, what's the amount of time that we feel we need in order to get enough data to kind of like make a change that we would feel confident in and is not going to like blow up the world. The hope is that when we're getting patches on our regular system starting in January, that we're not just always fighting the most recent fire, that we can actually like tone down stuff that's a little overpowered or kind of out of whack, and then also be doing some structural changes to the environment that makes things breaking like less kind of painful.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I mean, the idea of like these kinds of hotfixes. So yesterday, of course, we got a hotfix that I personally have gone on the record saying that I think was pretty amazing. And I said specifically, like, I think this new expansion, I loved it. The great design. I love Pantheon. I love actually pretty much all the new champions. But it did feel like Kennen and Yordle Explorer in particular were pretty oppressive, and it felt like it was kind of ruining the ranked ladder. So like seeing this hotfix come in within a week of the patch, I think for me and at least a really large portion of the community was a really, really great thing. And I mean, I guess the question is like, without promising anything, is this like something that we might be able to expect more of in future expansions? Because we haven't had these kinds of hotfixes very commonly.
Yeah, so it's a good question. This is, as you've kind of noted, it's outside the norm for what we usually do. Part of this was like Riot, is going to be going on vacation in a couple weeks,
Right.
and so there's going to be a big stretch of time where no one's there.
Yeah.
And we wanted to try and not, if something broke further,
Sure.
not have a situation where players are basically just sad. As for the future, my hope is that, and I think we kind of made this comment in the October statement on this, is hot fixes are kind of an emergency thing. Like we do them when we feel like we really need to. And so, the generic answer I'll give is we will do these when we need to. I think this patch more than anything has kind of showed a better way for us internally to measure when we should be trying to do this. But there's not going to be like a consistency thing here. I know some like B-side stuff was mentioned, or I've seen some stuff of like, hey, we get B-side patches every time.
B patches. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's completely reasonable. It is ideally something that we don't need every time, because as we're getting better at our releases, plus like those bigger balance patches, every other month, that the hope is that B-sides will be less useful. But I think it is a toolbox or a tool in our toolbox we have, and we'll definitely like be looking to use it when we need to.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good answer. I think it's been like a little bit underutilized in the past. Like I can think of one or two cases where like it probably would have been good to have a hotfix, at least from my perspective. I'm extremely glad like it's coming down this time and that it's something that you guys are definitely going to be very open to. Especially as someone who's like, I mean, who like I play a lot of ranked ladder and like the metagame, like not even at super high levels, but at like decently high levels, because I play a lot of like meme stuff too. Feels like it definitely can get into positions like that. So it's super, super good to hear that.
Yeah, there's a fine line that we try and walk, or at least my personal view is, I think one of the cool parts about card games is, as a player, it's trying to solve whatever's going on in the meta, because like our meta in a lot of ways is just whatever decks you guys agree to play.
Yeah, right.
If no one plays Ionia and no one plays Vandal City, our meta looks very different.
Yeah.
But that's a decision. And I think generally the way I view these kind of patches is, ideally y'all solve the problem, and then we only kind of step in and make changes when it's very clear that there's no amount of solving that the players can do in order to like kind of rectify the situation. And I'm hoping that we can kind of continue that moving forward. But it's gonna take some time.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. I think like one of the really big things that I did want to touch on, and this is like a really broad topic actually, is that the game has changed a lot in the last 2 years. Obviously, and you saw I was going through like the old patch notes, and for anyone that has played this game, not even from the start, not even from Bilgewater, but even like from around like when Targon came out, things started to change in a pretty specific direction. In a lot of different metrics and a lot of different axes, we've seen like pretty gradual trends that have basically all gone in one direction. For example,
like rallies becoming more predominant. We see stuff like card generation becoming more predominant. We see a lot of like matchup flexibility being like specific generations, like, you know, invoke and create kind of stuff, just like more fluidity within matchups being more predominant. We're seeing like removal becoming like kind of like falling off, which is partly because of the generation. And so I kind of wanted to talk about for a while like how you guys feel about these kinds of general trends. Can we start with, for example, like card generation, right? So like Bandle City came out, and card generation is hitting a peak, right? Not just with Bandle City cards, although there's a lot of those, but even with a lot of cards that have accompanied them, there's a lot more draw cards in the game than there used to be. One of the consequences of this is there's definitely, you know, aggro decks are kind of also ending up running a lot of card generation themselves, to the point where like pretty much every deck feels like it's forced to run some amount of draw to a degree. And removal is feeling like it's kind of hurt because of it, just because, you know, they play a thing and you remove it, but they drew a thing when they played it, right? So like, I mean, how do you feel about the state of card generation? Like, do you feel like this is kind of like a better direction overall, or like it went a bit too far maybe? Because there's pros and cons, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, no, that's it's a great call out, and it's actually something that is a tough thing for us to like. There's not like a single bullet that kind of takes care of all of these.
Exactly.
As you've kind of mentioned, or I should say, is like our game is an ecosystem, and so, you know, increasing, you know, one thing, you know, removes another. So I think card generation and just like general refillability of the board for decks is pretty high. I would say, you know, it's like probably a little higher than we would want. Bandle City may or may not be contributing to that in some number of ways. And we're aware of that. I mean, part of, like, again, the hotfix today, as well as some of the stuff that you guys are going to see in the January patch, is going to be stripping out some of the, like, the raw free power that they get, especially in areas where they probably just don't really need it to begin with, because they're supposed to have like strengths and weaknesses, and kind of now, right now, they're kind of good at everything. So, you know, I guess to answer your question more directly is like, yes, I think card generation at the moment is like, it's pretty high. It's also high in like basically every way. And it does force decks. Bandle City puts players in a situation where if you can't reload the board with bodies, then you probably need to be able to reload your hand to do whatever your strategy is. And that's like, yeah, we need to work on that. You did touch on this a little bit as well, and I think it is very much related, which is like our removal suite in our game is it has pretty big gaps, right? Yeah. Like, I think normally if you're playing a card game and you're saying, hey, the go wide strat is what's really good right now, I'm going to start grabbing some mid-range sweepers and punish them for it. And our mid-range sweeper option is like pretty rough against them. And part of that is a larger kind of like project that we are looking to take on in the new year. It's like, hey, how do we like make sure our interaction paths as a whole is just like a little more present in the game. We did this with buffs a little while ago, but I think, you know, removal is a pretty key part of that, and that is like something that we're looking to like figure out how to kind of increase in the game while not turning the game into a bunch of 1-for-1s. I think it's probably like the other big part of it.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, removal in Roontera, it comes down to a few different things, right? I mean, first of all, yeah, we've got this increased trend of card generation, and when you remove a card that generated a card, that feels bad. The second factor is that, I mean, you only get one attack every 2 turns in Runeterra. So in a lot of cases, removal options end up falling to the wayside compared to just blunting the opponent's attacks through either the means of stuns, frostbites, or even just chump blocking, right? Eye of the Dragon being a culprit, but not the culprit, right? Chump blocking is seen very, very commonly. So like, because the opponent only gets 1 attack every 2 turns, it feels really easy to just like stop attacking threats without removing them, to the point where removal is unnecessary. And then the third factor, of course, being the low board size, right? Like 6 units only allowed on board means like removing things also can allow them to redevelop in a lot of like swarmy things, whereas like sometimes chumping down just kind of like restricts that anyway. So yeah, I mean, it would be interesting because I know a lot of players, you know, come from other card games and they like these control archetypes where your idea is just this consumptive strategy of just stopping the opponent. You know, I remove your card, I counter everything you do. But like, the question is, I mean, do you guys want that kind of archetype to be predominant, right? Like, because a lot of people think that control is kind of inherently unfun or unhealthy. I mean, how do you envision control should be in Runeterra?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know it's something that like control memes have popped up recently.
Yeah.
And my general feel on control stuff in general is like I think control it's an important part of the game. It's a player fantasy that is kind of important. And if that's not there, it's pretty rough for those types of players, as well as like it just removes a pretty large swath of cards that we can make.
Yeah.
The type of control that I would say specifically try to discourage in our game is the like hyper do nothing control. I think commonly this show up in other games as like no creatures control or no units control, where I'm just playing like murder spells and counter spells, and your opponent doesn't get to do anything until you decide to win the game. Ionia sometimes is our closest version of that right now. Those are the type of control decks where, yeah, we're not really about having those in the game because they usually take a long time. And like one person gets to have fun.
Right.
And like it's a PvP game. Both players don't always get to have fun, but usually, even if you lose, you can sometimes do a cool thing and you feel a little bit better about that.
Mhm.
And so like those are the types of decks that we're generally going to be pretty, I would say, aggressive about trying to make sure aren't dominant strategies. Yeah. That being said, like I do think probably one of the biggest issues with control or having like what feels like a good control deck right now is um, the ability to like kind of feel like I think you're countering your opponent in a way that feels good is pretty rough. Sweepers are probably one of those biggest things of like, yep, I have a sweeper, I have my big spell that removes single targets. You kind of have your toolbox, and that toolbox is like pretty empty.
Yeah. So sweeper buff. I mean, it feels like the Avalanche and Ravine have definitely gotten like a little bit outclassed.
Yeah,
It's
and I think
it's cool to think about that kind of meta coming back.
yeah, and I think something that's like it's not said too much, but you kind of hint at it is like we are a new game. Our cards are very different from other card games,
Very.
and the it's funny to say is like a lot of early design in a new genre is like you're kind of like converting your favorite types of things into the game. You're like, oh, I want to see how this would look. Cool, that's a great card, I like. But it takes time to like design or start to create what it feels like Roontera cards. So a card that kind of feels like it would only be able to exist in Roontera. And I think you see that with a lot of our designs over time. As we got a little more comfortable in the system and like kind of what we wanted to do, card designs got better and they got more, I would say, appropriate for our engine. And a byproduct of that is a lot of our older cards kind of end up in that awkward spot of not quite fitting. And those are, I think, cards that are most of the time going to be prime targets for us to kind of like look at and see if we can kind of like, give a facelift and make them feel like they're actually reasonable and useful in the game.
Right. Essential cards. I mean, I think like one of the best things about how Runeterra takes control as a direction, and some players will disagree with this for sure. I do like how control decks in Runeterra always have a combo finish. There's some like purists that come from MTG that just want this like full attrition game plan where you just like sit there for like 30 minutes and don't even try to end the game, and it's just like, yeah, draw your last pathetic card, which I think is like, I mean, I'm sure some people like it, but it's fringe and not very feels good. I do like the fact that control decks in Runeterra have a finish. A lot of people think that, that they're more defined as combo decks because of that. Like people were saying like Trundle Lissandra is more of a combo deck than a control deck, which I kind of fundamentally disagree with. I mean, it can be both, right? Like it plays control in the early game. But I do think having like some kind of combo finish, not letting games get past like, turn 11 or 12 roughly is definitely a good thing for the game. And I like this direction a lot, but I do kind of miss, there was a certain point in like the time of Shadow Walls where like, I think I liked the idea of like the Lissandra combo. It ended up being kind of like a little too strong, but like that general like archetype of design felt pretty cohesive.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of those where like I do wish that the like TLC style decks were the deck was like a little healthier because it did present like a really cool moment of like, yeah, your opponent kind of like gets that pop off moment of like the water comes down, you just get to like have that really awesome thematic moment to that champion, as well as in game it feels like a really good control finisher. Um, yeah, so I think that was a good indication of like, okay, cool, we probably need to figure out how to make these kinds of decks in the future, but like interactable
Hmm.
or ones that don't kind of crush out so much of the meta.
Yeah, I think like that kind of old school style of control, like Shadow Owl's Frode coming back, that actually like tries to remove units. I do kind of miss it. Obviously, it's been very predominant for a very long period of time. But you know, after like several months ago, pretty much like Trundle Lysandra ended up being like less common of a dominant archetype since then. I think like one of the things about like new forms of control, which is like Ionia based, right? Which is just Eye of the Dragon and Concussive Palm oriented usually. I don't know, it can kind of like feel a bit worse because like, I mean, it's a pure psychology thing, but like still having your units and just not being able to do anything with them, as opposed to them just like getting countered and killed by a card, it just like literally just feels worse, you know? And then
Oh yeah, I completely agree.
I guess like, you know, I mean, this is probably a good segue into mini morph. We'd eventually have to come to this.
Yeah, I mean, once we started on the removal conversation,
you
it
knew
was
where
just
this was
time
going.
to mini morph. So
Yeah,
I'm ready.
I was
ready.
easing my way there.
Yeah. So I would make the statement of we are generally happy with what mini morph's role is in the meta, and what it's doing in that regard is great. And that it's like if there are decks that are running a single threat, mini morph is very good at kind of dealing with that single all in threat.
Yeah.
And that's what its role was kind of designed for. That being said, it's a frustrating card to play against, and I think given a different removal suite, that role could be filled by a different style of card,
Right.
and that would be great. But like the thing that is doing is pretty important, and the game
Sure.
is likely much worse off without it, because it is the thing that stops those single like unit control problems.
I think I do overall agree with that. It comes down to like the specific form that Minimorph is implemented with. I guess like my personal take and like how I would define it is that I actually like the reason I don't like Minimorph is actually because I like the idea of counter cards. Which specifically I think that the idea of counter cards is healthy, but it's always important to have a recounter to the idea of the counter, right? So the fact that Minimorph exists as just burst speed, in the way it exists, feels like it's a counter that doesn't allow for the opponent to have a recounter, right? And there's a lot of there's a lot of alterations. For example, I mean, there's a few different things. People are saying it could be fast speed, which is a common suggestion. There might be some UI issues involved with that. I can understand why a fast speed silence might be kind of awkward.
Yeah. To touch on that like a little bit, I mean, we have tried it as fast. It actually runs into the frost, like kind of like the fast frostbite problem when we do that. And that's like, it's super painful, and it ended up leading to more problems than it actually solved.
Do you want to break down that problem for anyone that might not know?
Yeah. So like what we call like frostbite logic is, you have a unit that you want to play against. Your opponent plays a fast speed for frostbite targeting your unit. You're like, cool, I'm going to stop that. I'm going to play a spell to, make sure my unit has like +3 attack, and then I won't die. And then the spells resolve, your unit gets a +3 attack, you get frostbitten, it goes to 0, and you're sad. Minimorph has the same issue of like, unless the one of two cards you're playing is a spell shield or a counter spell, or deny, then anything that you do that looks like it might be useful is like not going to matter.
Yeah.
And that is in many ways worse because it puts the player in a position of like feeling pretty dumb for thinking that the game worked in a way that it didn't work. And it ends up burning a bunch of resources. And so that's like, kind of one of the things that we're very sensitive to when we're talking about cards like this.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that kind of thing is important, right? Like a lot of people, especially the game community, like the very dedicated game community that's often suggesting these kinds of things, often don't consider like the new player experience or like flavor implications. Like I've seen some people suggesting just make the mini TF4, but that's not very mini, right? That's not mini at all. That's a huge thing, right? Like, I mean, like my personal thing that I've kind of been thinking about a lot is, and again, I like the idea of having a counter, but it feels like there should be a recounter opportunity. For example, a deck like Scion that depends on the ability to attack. It's good to have some kind of counter to that might be able to, like, you know, see higher or lower amounts of play depending on how much Scion is in the meta. I think that's totally fine. When it comes to something like Minimorph, I think, for example, here's a hypothetical. What if Minimorph was lasted for the turn instead of being permanent? It would be affecting champions. It could make it a smaller stat line than a 3/3. It's possible it could even be 5 mana, although that one, you know, I don't know about that. That would still be a good counter to the idea of stopping an opponent attacker, right? Something like Scion, something like Lee Sin, that would be effectively still shutting it down for a single turn in a really, really huge way, right? Which is kind of all you ever need against those kinds of archetypes. And when you block, you can kill their unit. But if they have a chance to protect it, then they still have the ability to feel like they're not getting completely shut down, right? Kind of giving them a counter to your counter. Obviously, biggest implication here, it would feel kind of comparable to Whimsy, which is kind of like Hush versus Purify, right? Being able to target champions. I mean, what would be the issue with that?
Yeah, so I think it's a good suggestion. It's something that like I think it's been brought up a couple times, and we've talked about it internally. And it's possibly, with how things have changed, it's worth us revisiting and seeing like, hey, is there some legs here? I think some of the biggest issues with it is, and I know we're speaking in terms of counters, but at its core, you know, when we're talking about cards like this, like they kind of, if they're able to do their job reliably, that's good. Counters being a part of that is important, but like at its core, we need that card to do the thing. If I remember correctly, when we were playtesting it, somewhat similar to that, the issue was, you know, our buff suite is pretty high right now. Like it's very easy for players to protect their stuff. And so oftentimes what seems like a sweet window of, cool, you know, I'll minimorph this thing in combat, then I'll get to kill the 3/3 and it'll feel good, oftentimes resulted in either the opponent just not doing anything. And so you kind of just stall the game out by a round, and that increases game length in a way that's like not awesome. Sure. Or what ends up happening is your opponent has like the combat buffs anyway, they have the sharp sight, or they have, you know, whatever they need. And so you burn your spell to get 2 for 1. And then your opponent just gets to do whatever they want to do afterwards, which kind of like goes against this thing needs to be able to remove that strong thing. And we already kind of struggle with removal feeling potent. And so asking players to get opted into 2 for 1s, or having to like commit Minimorph and then commit a bigger kill spell afterwards is like, it's a pretty high ask in terms of actually making that tool feel actually useful. Yeah, that's kind of like where we're at. I do think though, with how stuff has changed since Minimorph has come out, it's probably worth us looking at or trying that as you know, part of whatever our upcoming stuff is.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. To clarify, you know, I obviously, you know, for anyone who doesn't know this or hasn't been able to guess, I've had a pretty anti-Minimorph perspective generally. That being said, I do want to clarify, it's more of like, it's always been more of kind of like a long-term perspective. I don't think like in this current meta, Minimorph is like, I mean, it's not even seeing like that much play. It's like mostly just in, you know, some of the like super slow like Bandle Generation decks and Bandle Tree. It's probably in like less than half of Bandle decks if we're going by like the amount of games played, if we're weighing it by that. But yeah, no, that's good to hear. I mean, it's not really, it's just something that it was kind of obligatory at this point, just because I've talked about the card several times in the past.
Absolutely. And sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, I really did like that point you were saying about like not wanting to extend the games further. I mean, did you have something to say? Because I was gonna transition that.
I was just gonna say, like, I do understand that, like, even if you see Minimorph once every 10 games, the way that it does its thing is just like particularly frustrating.
Exactly.
Long-term hope is, or I would also say that like the amount of Minimorph that is in the game is like much higher than we would like as well. I think when we're looking at like, hey, I want a particular type of removal. Ideally, you're like, cool, that region has that. I'm going to dip into that region to do it. Bandle City is a little prolific at the moment, and so what would normally be a deck building cost to get that type of removal is kind of non-existent. And I think as we're starting to like kind of reshape Bandle City back to in terms of like having a little more normal power level, and decks don't feel like they have to go into Bandle City to get everything that they need, the Minimorph stock will kind of drop a little bit, which will hopefully help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I was so that's I think that's a great answer. I'm definitely not really too worried. Like as long as that's the perspective and like things like will change when they need to. I don't think it's a problem for now. But I really did like your answer about not wanting games to extend too long because I do agree. I mean that's exactly what I was saying with control decks. Feeling like I like the idea of combo finish. And something that feels kind of like been the case in Runeterra for a while is it does feel like there's kind of a lack of proper finishers in Legends of Runeterra, which does feel like it's contributing to A, games going on a little bit too long, and B, kind of like a fairly narrow range of strategies. It feels like there's a lot of cards and champions that are actually like pretty decent archetypes, but that are crippled by their lack of a finisher, right? And I guess like Yasuo will be an easy example of that. There's like there's this idea of the archetype. The most successful Yasuo archetypes in the past were basically just Swain decks that ran Yasuo because Swain can lead to a finisher. And I was wondering like how you guys feel about that and like how you could kind of like change them more. I think that that's also contributing to the prevalence of rallies being kind of like one of the only finishers that we really have access to that can give board stats.
Yeah, no, I again, this is something I agree with. Our range or catalog of finishers is pretty narrow. Usually, as you kind of mentioned, they're showing up as either I just overwhelm you with the board, like the board is just a bunch of things that kill you, or it's like Captain Decimate. I just deal a bunch of face damage to you. I think our like single unit finishers are the ones that tend to struggle a lot. Part of it is, I think, especially given kind of like the raw power level of a lot of our lower to mid cost units. They're just more efficient at kind of like slowly chipping away and getting a player justifying trying to put like a 7, 8, 9, 10 cost unit into your deck is like it's actually kind of difficult because you could probably have just won it through other means. That is something that we are, I think, for old cards, these bigger balance patches are going to be great for us to be able to kind of reevaluate cards that were supposed to be finishers and kind of update them. And I think for future design, that is something that we are taking a much more not aggressive, but we're more aware of it when we're looking at future sets.
Sure. No, I mean, I think something in particular, like while we're going down that road, something that I would identify feels kind of missing from Runeterra as a subcategory to the idea of finishers is kind of like finishers that have a way of making board stats feel like they matter, right? Like, as an example, okay, so in Runeterra, obviously you only get to attack once every other turn. And I think this is kind of like one of the key things that separates it from other card games and dictates like how things work and how cards need to be printed, how the game is played, right? And because you only get to attack every other turn, the idea of like stats being a way to close out the game, like unit stats, like having high attack, has a really hard time being able to put enough pressure on when they can just like block down with small things. So you need keywords like elusive or overwhelm or kind of like rallies, which we're seeing a lot of in the last several months, especially with like new card generation, meaning you're never going to run out of a board. Rallies have been extremely predominant. So I guess what I was thinking was the idea, something that would be good for Runeterra is not just the idea of more finishers, but the idea of different ways, especially outside of Demacia, of being able to make board stats into a relevant finisher. Shadow Isles has Atrocity, which is, competitive and always has been, but it works on a single big unit instead of a wide board, right? It would be really, really cool if we saw some non-rally options. As a random example, Pack Mentality, the card, Freljord to give everything +2/+2 and Overwhelm. If these kinds of cards were like printed a bit more aggressively and like had a way to like turn a big board into a finisher, maybe it could be attached to some kind of condition that was like you could see coming, like you could build towards. I feel like that kind of thing would definitely do a lot in terms of but both like increasing the diversity of different kinds of finishers and like branching out from like rallies feeling identifiable. I mean, any thoughts on that?
Again, I agree. I think to broach the rally topic a little bit, this is something that we're very aware of. When we did the initial kind of nerf to rallies earlier this year, the first question before doing that was like, hey, is there just a way for us to like make it so players aren't running double rallies in every single deck that's Demacia? And the answer was like, yes, at a cost. Unfortunately, I think the majority of Demacia's identity right now is rallies. Yes. And so if we had kind of like correctly costed rallies or made them interactable or whatever in a way that like felt correct, we actually have a pretty large risk of Demacia as a region just kind of crumbling.
Sure, absolutely.
And so that is a like we do want to fix it. It requires us to kind of like retool Demacia as a whole.
Right.
And
game design. So I think something is important to understand. I'm sorry to cut you off, but like game design is very complicated. Sometimes like to be able to take something out, you have to be like ready to put something in at the same time, so the structure doesn't fall apart, right? You have to like you want to remove it and replace it, but you got to be ready to do both. You know, like I completely get what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of Jenga. And so like us doing that is like it is important. I think in terms of like hey, what are some I'm not going to say divergent finishers, but just like variant of finishers is, I agree. I think things like pack mentality are great. Our evasive keywords, which is generally what we kind of qualify things like elusive, fearsome, overwhelm, and impact. The number that we have is like, it's pretty low, I think, in terms of how different do you build your deck with those. Impact was a version of that we felt would be cool because it's like, yeah, you can have this on a lot of small units and that'll feel nice because they can like slowly chip down. But we do need more of those, and we need different ways to kind of like let you interact with them.
Sure.
And that is, that's design space that we like are very excited to kind of figure out and kind of like mine as we can. As for cards like Pack Mentality, I think there's a couple of other ones. It's the Shadow Isles card. It's not Stalking Shadows. It's the other one with the little gremlin dude on it. But
Encouraging Shadows?
Yeah, Encouraging Shadows. I think cards like that are good examples of, these cards just could be better and could lead to ways for us to finish. The tough part with those cards, and we do very much want to kind of update those as we can, is some of them were more flavor focused, or they were cards that we released in earlier sets, and the identity of that region kind of is no longer towards that. So we have to like pick the ones that are sweet for like that feel good for that region,
sure.
And kind of like prop those up or make them feel better.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned Encouraging Shadows as an idea, as an example, because of course, I mean, I do love that card both as a player and as a designer. The thing that I think Encouraging Shadows does really, really well as sort of a finisher is it's not even just a finish. It's something that your opponent can see coming. It's like it requires setup. Because one other problem is that, LOR feels a little light on finisher options, but also, and I think this is something that a lot of players internalize but aren't really necessarily like consciously aware of, which is that LOR has a very like abrupt set of finishers. Like finishers in LOR often end up coming down. This has been like pretty historically consistent throughout the last 2 years. Like most finishers are just like, oh, I guess they have the thing, I guess I'm dead now, right? And of course rallies fall into that. Even like Pack Mentality and Atrocity would fall into that. Scion falls into that. Lee Sin falls into that. It's just like, do they have the thing? I do think, I mean, Lee Sin is obviously a little bit different because you can see the Lee Sin like building up in their deck, and I really like the idea of finishers that give you, a bit more of an indication than feeling like in that end game state of like, oh, they have it or they don't. It feels, just a little bit almost anticlimactic. Like there's not build up to it, right? I like, Bandletree being kind of built up, although Tree itself has some things that peripherally make it maybe anti-fun, but just like that build-up element. And Encroaching Shadows fits perfectly into that. It's a finisher that you kind of like that, like they see it on turn 3 and they're like, I've got to start finishing this game. They're encroaching, right? Like that's really cool. I love the idea, like the design of that kind of finisher is great. And I actually think that champion levels are a really good way of facilitating that as well, because it's just like they can see the counter ticking up. I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot. I know this was like a Q&A, but
no, I think it's good. It's from my end, it's like it's great to hear thoughts on these, especially because like I'm sure my eyes are bouncing around. What I'm doing is like I'm actually taking notes in a notepad of like, hey, when we get back, let's talk about finisher options with the team.
Yeah.
As an example, I agree. I think historically, when we were designing champions and cards that kind of like were those like long tail finishers that feel really good.
Mm-hmm.
Our previous designs kind of focused on, well, if we're going to do a design like that, we should probably put it on a champion because we know those are cards that players want to play, and we wouldn't want a champion to be overshadowed by this other card. I think over time, as we've developed more cards, we've realized that like that's not necessarily a hard requirement. Like we can make some champions that don't have those really long, really complicated finishers. And I think that's good. And it gives us kind of a little more design space for those. I think you're very much right in like cards like Encroaching Shadows are cool because they're at the start of the game, you see your opponent play that, and you're like, as the person playing against, you're like, okay, that's the kind of game we're going to be in. I need to adjust my strategy, right? Versus the oops, you're dead, or surprise, you're dead. And so like, yeah, I think we need more of those. And 100% agree. Of there is a sweet spot of, as your opponent, you either can understand that this is a game that you need to kind of adjust your strategy to, or you get enough advance notice of like, okay, in 2 rounds or 3 rounds, my opponent's going to play X card. I need to like set up my board or set up my hand for it. And it's not just cool. Yeah, they have it or they don't have it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that like that would allow. I mean, right now, I think kind of like where I feel personally as a player is like the idea of like a higher diversity of like deck building options, because deck building is always a process of like like you start with a finisher and then you work your game plan backwards, thinking like, okay, how can I start building towards this finisher? And there's so many cool concepts in LOR. I guess like Arel the Tracker is another one that like you see Arel the Tracker, the 6 mana 2/5 Noxus card, I believe, that like every turn if you cast a spell she strikes something, and like that kind of card is really cool, but you can't really build around something that's not going to be starting to close games, especially because in Legends of Runeterra, if you're not trying to end the game by like turns 7 to 9 roughly, it's not really going to be able to be competitive. So I mean, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit more about rallies, because it's something that I wanted to. I'm very curious on your guys' thoughts. I'm actually not even 100% sure. I mean, there's a few different factors as like why rallies have gotten so good over the past like 2 years. They've been kind of slowly creeping up. And a lot of it is just like more generation, more stats. But I mean, do you have any ideas like what kinds of solutions you might go for? Because it's tricky, right? Like you can't just like replace Demasia's identity. Like are rallies fundamentally something that you think might need to be changed themselves, or is it just like a byproduct of like too much card generation or state of the meta?
I think it's a mix of things. So like card generation is definitely one of them. I would also say unit quality in general has just gone up over time.
Right.
So it's like in foundations, or even in something like Rising Tides, the average quality or stats per unit on board were they were okay, right? Especially way different compared to now. And so like the return of on interest in the rally then was just like not as great. And so that, I think, and that just usually happens when you have more cards kind of in the system. As for like, I think solutions for rally, I do think to some degree like more of it in the system in other areas or different versions of it does help, because it doesn't feel like you have to go here and use that version of it. That's like things like smaller versions of rally or weird versions of rally. I think those would be helpful. The bigger one for us is like, I think we kind of just need to figure out like, hey, what should a like X mana slow rally, what should that actually cost?
Yeah.
I think we can all agree that like 3 probably a little too cheap. 4 still might be too cheap. But again, we kind of run into the I think when we are looking to kind of fix that as a whole, we'll have to figure out like, hey, what are those costs are, and then kind of readjust Demacia around it. But yeah, I think that's the tough part. Some other stuff that I think we've at least played around with internally is like better or more interesting conditionals to then get to rally, as a way to at least feel like as the opponent, I know that they're going to try and rally because they're setting up this one unit to do whatever that condition is. Stuff like that, I think, good.
Right. I mean, I was thinking about it, and I mean, we have like, for example, like Citrus Courier from Bilgewater. Cards never really seen like a ton of play, but it could be that kind of designed, maybe if like balanced like to 5 mana, that kind of design where they have the, rally might not be able to tap into spell mana. It's like locked onto a unit, and they have to see it coming with like the plunder that they have a chance to potentially stop. I think there's definitely a lot of things there, for sure. Or like I know some people have talked about the idea of maybe like making it so like the rally cards are like a your turn only kind of thing. Like you can just get a second attack on your attack turn, and obviously very rebalanced about that. But yeah, no, I'm definitely very interested to see like what your guys' approach to that will eventually be, because I completely agree. You know, you don't want to gut rally until you have like the right solution, right? Like the thing that's important to understand, and you know, is partly what you're saying. Like, just hastily doing a decent solution is not better than just like waiting to do a good solution, right? And that's what you're talking about with like, you know, trying not to do like these fast hot fixes too much, making sure that the solutions are the ones that are going to be best long term. But yeah, super excited to see what the rally is going to be. Speaking of, you know, changing things in the balance patches and stuff like that, something that has been talked about a little bit recently is that in a lot of the more recent balance changes, you know, I've liked a lot of the big ones. I was a really big fan of the one in June. Like every single like patch note, all 40 of them were just amazing and really revitalized a lot of like the interest in the game for like people that have been playing for a long time. There's so many new things to do, and it feels like there have been less like buffs to weak cards. Like at a certain point, you know, very early on, and I remember a lot of like the dev posts about like, you know, making sure cards aren't being underplayed, buffing weak cards, buffing weak champions. And it feels like recently, like last like several months or year, there's been less buffs to champions or like underperforming cards or archetypes. Is that something we might be able to expect more of, or like what's the philosophy on that, or has it changed?
Yeah, so good news. That is exactly what we are
Oh,
focusing on for those larger patches. Like the one in January, kind of like to break down kind of how we're looking at those types of patches is they're kind of broken up into a couple sections. The like first thing that we have to do is kind of like what we call the requirements of like, yep, we gotta like balance or touch whatever is currently kind of like causing problems.
yeah.
And so, you know, not a spoiler, but we'll be looking at Vandal City as part of that. The second, you know, the kind of like second tier there is like, hey, what was our overall goal for the patch? So if our goal for a patch is like, we're looking at, you know, interaction. So like, cool, there's going to be some number of changes in there that are kind of dedicated to an interaction pass. Or it's like we were talking about rallies. It's like, cool, that's where we're going to fix rallies. That's the core part of that. And then there's like this other section that is essentially just like, hey, what are things that we can change and update to just make the game feel better? Sometimes these are like pet projects of like a particular designer's like, yeah, I think the way this particular card or this subsystem is really just not great, and I want to fix it. You might have seen in the last couple of patches where we've been updating targeting stuff for various cards. That's an example of, you know, that's just a thing that we care a lot about, and we know you guys care a lot about. But more broadly, that section is going to be things like, you know, buffing cards that are less played, or, you know, trying to find cards that we think are worth updating. You know, that tweet that I put out a couple months ago asking y'all about like, hey, what are some of your favorite things? That is, I think we'll be kind of, you'll see a little bit more of that in that patch, but like the point of that thing was legitimately to get a good list for us to be able to just pull from, that we like know for sure players care about in some way. And you know, there's not going to be like a 1-to-1 or anything, but that there is a section for every patch to essentially like be focusing on cards like that. There's no promises that like all of those cards will suddenly become meta, but there is a much more, I would say, like there's a much better approach to looking at buffing cards that aren't just good cards or cards that we particularly think like are required to be meta, but also just like cards that have fallen by the wayside or we think it'd be fun, things like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it feels like the kinds of like talks that I've been seeing from the community are like addressing mostly a lot of cards that are just like very safe buffs, right? Like the kinds of cards that are like so weak that you can kind of just like buff them by like 1 point or 1 mana or something like that, you know, wouldn't really like cause any issues. Of course, you know, when lumped with a lot of other changes together, some of them can, depending on like the kinds of decks they would fit into. But a lot of the cards that I've never really seen like, you know, play in any kind. That's really great to hear though. Like I mean I have heard that this you know, this January patch might be looking to be a little hot, a little spicy.
Yeah, I mean there's definitely so to be fair, the hotfix did pull some of the spicy out of it.
Fair enough.
It's funny because like some amount of those changes that we kind of pulled into the hotfix were ones that we had earmarked for 3.0. Not the exact numbers because we had to kind of adjust to what was going on, but like, we were looking to pull those in. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about the January patch. I think there's a lot of like there are a lot of changes that we were able to get in that I feel they're just like cool. Like, no idea if they're going to be good or not. No idea if like they're going to meaningfully change the play rate of any cards, but they're cool. They're just like, it's a cool change. This is a cool thing. I'm excited to like, see if like any weird deck pops up or like whatever it might be.
Yeah. Oh, I that actually does have me a little bit excited. I'm looking forward to seeing exactly what we're gonna be getting in January. Oh, I wanted to talk a little bit about something something that I'm curious what your thoughts on are, which is the idea of just like how spell speed works in Runeterra. Spell speed is, for those of you guys who don't know, I mean, I'm sure everyone at least remembers, like when you first start playing Runeterra, it's pretty counterintuitive. Like there's always this like this of like it takes a few games to like get down the idea of like the alternating pass system and how spell speed fits into that. Like when you have the action and when you don't, and it's definitely like something that I've talked about with a few people that feel like it's kind of like one of the big impediments for new players. I also happen to think that like the way certain spells work, like for example, a lot of slow spells that are kind of designed to be like power cards or finishers, feel very limited by the fact that you have to just like spend everything on them, and like they're very disruptible, like kind of like, so for example, some like pack mentality as well. Something that's stopping it from feeling like it's going to be able to be competitive isn't just the numbers on it, but just like the way it works, right? Like your opponent is always going to have the opportunity to disrupt it. I don't know, like, I mean, how do you feel about spell speed? More focusing on like the new player dynamic of it all, because I know for a fact that there's at least like some people on the team that are like, that might feel like it's possibly a little awkward, and it's just something I've talked about. Sorry,
Yeah.
that was incredibly that was the worst question I've ever. That was super rambly.
No. I think the TLDR is like, it's kind of like slow spell speed why, and that's like a very valid question. So this is I think probably a perfect example of I think focus speed came out after the game was live, and so I think that speed kind of ate up a lot of what we would traditionally make slow spells. And so slow spells are in a bit of a weird spot in terms of like,
Yeah,
we kind of need to really bribe you in order to justify playing a card that is slow. Like it actually has to be
kind of
pretty good, or the effect has to be so interesting that you're willing to like eat that cost to do it. And I think we're underutilizing what we could be doing for slow spells is essentially what I think. We definitely have in previous playtests, or like in the before times before we ship, not having that speed. We think my current thought here is like I do still think that speed has value.
right.
We just kind of need to like do the work to make it feel like that to players, and I think do a better job of splitting up kind of like what is a focus speed spell or what feels like a focus speed spell and what feels like a slow spell. And that's actually like a good note for me of like making sure that we're actually like looking at that as a specific kind of thing. I think another thing that you kind of called out there was like kind of like it's just like the onboarding experience and it being a little confusing. Teaching card games is hard. It turns out,
right.
there's a lot of complicated things, and it's repetition is pretty important, I think, in terms of like learning stuff. Our current Path of Champions is kind of a good I think a step
Super
up from where we were in terms of being a onboarding experience for newer players. I know that team is like they care a lot about that, and as the lore team as a whole is kind of like very interested in kind of like making sure that we're improving that experience as much as we can. The tough part about onboarding and stuff like that is once you've gone through onboarding, once you've learned something about the game, your ability to give an opinion on it actually drops pretty considerably because you already subtly can like kind of like shortcut stuff in a way that a player that's like never seen the game before can. So those efforts, I think generally are a little more long tail, but yeah, I think something like spell speeds is an example of it can definitely muddy the waters. I would also say just like spell timings is another one that's pretty tough in terms of like, oh, if I cast a fast spell in combat versus not in combat, like that has different implications. You know, those types of like weird little nuances that tend to like trip people up.
Yeah, no, Path of Champions is really really good for that onboarding. I remember I think it was mentioned at when we were having dinner a couple weeks ago that the reason that all the starter decks, I think it was all the starter decks, or at least like the Jinx decks, only had burst speed spells was to kind of ease players into like how spells work. Like that's why I forget what it's called, but the removal spell in that deck, the 2 mana deal 3 or whatever, is burst speed because it's just like it streamlines that process and the player can kind of learn the mechanics and then learn spell speeds later, which I mean it was really cool. I didn't even realize that until it was mentioned.
Yeah, there's a lot of subtle design that goes into those.
Right.
And our the designers on that team are extremely smart and good at like figuring that stuff out. And I'm it is so good that like I didn't even notice that when I first ran through it of like, oh yeah, I guess after that fact, I went back and played it and I was like, yep, that is true. So yeah, I'm hopeful that that team is kind of like they're incorporating those changes and they're kind of adjusting as they can. And then ideally our changes help them because it's like giving them more obvious, cards to use for slow speed, burst speed, focus speed, and things like that.
Yeah, I was a big fan of the way emotes were implemented. That the AI emoting felt great in the Path of Champions.
Yeah, so funny story about that is a real quick aside. We do a Thunderdorm every once in a while where it's just like players or our team can kind of work on whatever they want. That emote system kind of came about because one of our engineers, who's extremely good at the game and also a bit of a troll, was just like, I'm gonna have the AI emote at you, and it's gonna emote based off of the type of AI it is. And just like went super deep on that for like 3 days. There was a designer that was working there. And I have no doubt the designer also did a lot of work, but that engineer was just like he was all about it. And the day it went live, I think him and I both were watching you, and I was like linking him like when you were getting tilted by the AI, kind of emoting you at the right time. You're like, dude, you created a monster. He's like, this is exactly what I want. So that's been it's been cool. And I'm glad that it was received mostly well. I will admit that I get a little ragey when I'm like playing Path and I get the looks thumbs up emote. I'm like, get out of here.
Oh god, wait, that's so funny. What was his name? The engineer who did this?
That is Neil Anderson.
Neil,
I think he sent some interview. Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
All right, guys. If you're playing a lot of Path of Champions and you're getting emoted by AI, it's just Neil doing it to you. All right. Like.
Yeah. It's. Yeah, there is no AI. It's actually just Neil with a bunch of like a big monitor setup, just emoting individually for each of your guys' games. So
it is great though. Like actually, especially like for just like mad respect, just like that kind of story where like you just like go deep on something for like a few days because it is actually a really really good system and it makes it feel a lot more organic. Although it is like hilariously kind of like they do go a little hard on the emotes sometimes.
They do, and I think some of them even have like specific emote responses. So if like they do an emote and you a specific emote in response, like there's a cool thing that happens. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's like a whole sub game in there that I'm just like I only know the very lightest edges of it.
Oh, I can imagine. Like I haven't seen the depth of that algorithm, but I mean there seems to be more than I've seen. I guess I could say.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's really cool. Let me see. I'm curious. So something I did want to talk about, and this was, it's kind of funny. We joked about this during the disconnect, but I'm curious what the thoughts are about a potential set rotation. I actually don't even remember what the philosophy was before. So for those of you guys, actually. Do you want to explain what a set rotation is and then like what your particular beliefs or like the team's beliefs are on it?
Yeah. So rotation is typically when the game has like X number amount of cards, and you essentially remove some amount of those cards up to including all of them out of what you consider the normal kind of like game mode. I think usually this is called like standard or whatever, but it's like the queue that you're currently queuing in today. Those cards are no longer valid, like playable in that queue, and then new cards kind of get introduced to that you can play. And it's generally pretty important for kind of resetting power levels. One issue that I think we are starting to rub up against is the more cards you print in a in an environment, the base power level kind of goes up. Games will typically get faster because decks are just able to be more efficient. There's like less holes that you kind of have to make do with. And those will and on the design side, the problem is that it's actually pretty hard to design new cards in that system. Like I think right now a good example is like if I give you a design task of design a 1 to 3 drop aggressive card in Noxus that does not invalidate any of the other 1 to 3 drops in Noxus, it's a pretty tall order. Unless you're willing to just give it way more stats than everything else, right? Like we've kind of like mined out the space there. And so rotation is usually pretty helpful for stuff like that. And my general thought on it is like I do think rotation is important. There's significant downsides to it. I think especially for players and when it comes to like all your decks becoming invalidated or your favorite strategy or some of your strategies, no longer being that you can play anymore because like X, Y, or Z cards that we loved is no longer there. And so those are things that like we do have to consider pretty heavily when we're talking about rotation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's something that I mean, what you were saying about like 1 to 3 drops in Noxus. I think it was like I think it was when Riven came out, and like at the time, like there was already just like Draven in 3 and LeBlanc in 3. Maybe it was LeBlanc that was the last one, but I remember people were like, oh, I mean, how are you possibly gonna compete with all these like good Noxus 3 drops, right? Like it's like every Noxus champion just wants to be slammed on 3 and just like go to town, right? But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of upsides and downsides. It's a very like major fundamental change, right? So I mean, it's nothing that like it. Would you say it's like something that could possibly happen in the future?
Yeah, I obviously can't talk about like future future content. Otherwise, I think our pub team might just assassinate me.
Of course.
But I think the things I can say is like we are. It is something that is important to us. We do think that it is valuable for the game and players. The but we have a different set of considerations, I think, than most card games do. Sure. Namely, like the way that players kind of acquire cards in our game actually is a benefit in terms of like it gives us more tools to be able to rotate or do different types of rotations than just a full rotation, which I think is actually great. And it means that like we have ways to kind of think about the problem space that is interesting.
Right.
My confidence is that like whatever we end up with is going to feel good for like Legends. It's going to feel like a rotation that makes sense for Legends of Runeterra and not just kind of like this is how everyone else has done it. It's the easiest kind of solve. We'll just do that thing and it'll be great.
I can't stress how happy I am that you said that. That's a great answer, actually. Because like I mean, people do get in this idea of like having to do rotations in a specific way. Like I think that there's a lot of different ways you can do it, and Runeterra does have like a very unique opportunity with the card acquisition, like you were saying, to do things different and fitting. So I honestly, if when that could end up happening, I'm interested in seeing like how that might look, because that would be. It's cool to imagine, like for example, like Yu-Gi-Oh did, instead of rotations, that had like a rotating ban list, which not a good solution, but it's an example of an alternate solution, I guess. But yeah, that's very, very cool. I mean, part of the reason I bring up rotations is because people are talking about TFT right now, the new set, and like the idea of like the rotations that TFT has as well, which are also very different fundamentally from the way card games do rotations. And so I think those ideas of like big mix-ups would be really nice. I do think that something that is kind of interesting, and I don't know if you'll be able to talk about this, but part of like what appeals to me about the idea of some kind of rotation is just like a big that feeling of like a big reset, like a big mix-up all at once, which feels like in Runeterra has been kind of missing due to like the split expansion systems, right? And I guess one thing that I believe we don't know in the community yet is how future expansions will launch, like whether they'll be split or whether they'll be bigger all at once, now that we have all 10 regions in the game. Is that something you could provide any amount of thoughts on at all?
I can. I'm lucky in that I work on those, so I can at least figure out how to thread the needle here a little bit. Yeah, so I think you're right. With Bandle being the 10th region and us making the commitment of like, yeah, we're not releasing a new region anymore.
Right.
It does require us to kind of think about how and what the ways we release content very differently. Traditionally, the way we would do content releases like new set is X region, cool. What's that region about thematically? Who are the obvious champions we want to get in there? Great. What are mechanics that we think make sense for them? And then we kind of build it out from there. New set design is it's very different now because we don't have that anchor as a starting point. And I think the future set teams who are doing all of the work and they're great have found a pretty cool way of going about it. And hopefully, players are excited about as we are.
Okay.
And I am like mostly looking at chat here, and I'm seeing like a lot of Void and Ishtal things. This is not to crush those dreams. We will. We as internal players love those regions. Love what those things are and those champions from those places. It is likely when we are talking about those, or when we go to like introduce those, we will probably find a way that feels good for that region. To get them kind of like in the game, and that'll like likely be something we take a lot of care to, because we do know that fans of those two like regions care a lot about them, and we don't want to like make it feel bad or make it feel like it was this is the best we could do. So I hope you like it. We want to do better than that.
I was a big fan of the 11-17 Void reveal theory. That was a very good one. People like analyzing the Watcher stat line. November 17th. It's on a Wednesday, guys. It's definitely the Void reveal.
I mean, we definitely had at least one or two new people that had joined the team, and maybe a couple people that had been on the team for a while asking like one of the design channels like, "Hey, is something happening? Because like that's like next week, and if I've got to like get something alive, we should probably know. I haven't seen anything yet." And it was pretty good. But yeah, I think that was a very good kind of like thing dropped in by that team.
So why is it 11-17?
That is a good question. I've intentionally not gotten the answer for that one because I don't want to accidentally spoil it. You'll have to ask the.
There is something to it. It's not just random trolling.
I don't know. Legitimately, I don't know either way. It was one of those I looked at. I was like, this is probably good for me not to have a clear answer on.
All right. Well, you guys, they clearly meant November 17th of 2022. So check back next year. That time for sure. That time Void for sure.
Yeah. Results unclear.
But yeah, no, that's really cool to hear. I'm excited to see how like the new launches will go and exactly how those will be kind of like segmented, and kind of like made kind of like more impactful, because I actually really like this most recent one, right? I mean, like I said, didn't really like the initial power level of Canon Explorer. Hotfix made that amazing. Like this last one, for when you do these like 40 card launches, it's kind of hard to like shake up the meta in a major way, but this last one was actually really great, with Pantheon, with Ari, with Rumble. There's actually a lot of cool things you can mess around with those that don't even feel like you have to build like specific decks, which is really, really nice as a feeling to just like have that, like, the waking up on Christmas, like the, oh, I can do all these new things in the new patch or the new set rotation, or what have you.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. I definitely have been watching your Rumble games. And to answer your question on like why is Rumble the way he is, I think, and you can blame me for this one specifically because I was the one that worked on Rumble and his archetype.
You, huh?
It was me. Scion and I did both Scion and Rumble as like the initial lead at least. Rumble's half was a bit open-ended in terms of like we know that if you put him in a deck with Scion, that is a functional deck, and likely leads to something cool and interesting.
Sure.
There was an then open question of like, okay, but what about the kind of like the Mecha Yordle deck? What does that look like? And we had some internal brews that were pretty cool and interesting, but we didn't have a hard solve for like, this is the Rumble deck, and we think this is what it's going to look like, and players are going to play this. And that was a little intentional of like, man, the deck is really weird, and all the mechs do some really strange stuff, and who knows what players are going to like end up with. I'm still confident that we'll find something that is like not entirely memey, but it is at least on our radar of like we might have missed the mark on that one a little bit, just because of like how weird he is, and I think some of those mechs just being potentially very scary. Like Lil Dipper definitely was one where I was like, "Ooh, if this card ends up being good, we're not going to know about it for the first like month, and then it's gonna like break the game in a really weird way."
Yeah.
And so
Right.
we were more conservative on stuff like that than maybe we needed to, but yeah, I would say for that one at least, that's kind of like why he is the way he is.
Yeah, no, that I mean that makes perfect sense. It's kind of interesting. Like, I mean, Rumble's actually like a perfectly serviceable card in Scion decks. Like, he's not even really bad. I think the biggest problem that people are finding when they're trying to make competitive decks is, of course, that it's kind of hard to justify the champ slot. And that leads me to another thing, which is that as we're getting to this point, I believe very roughly, but very close to half of all League of Legends champions are now currently in Legends of Runeterra. We're right at that 50% mark, right around. And we're getting to the point where it does feel like the limitation that you have, which is that 6 champs per deck, means that you can only run 2 different champs if you want to run 3 copies of each. It starts to feel more and more constrictive, you know, as time goes on. And of course, we're only halfway there, so it can only really start even being more constrictive in terms of like things seeing viable play, right? You know, like Draven Scion, Draven is kind of like too hard to cut. Like, even as a 2 health unit is just like so good in how that deck wants to play, and it feels like it's kind of hard to fit in third wheels in so many decks. There's actually a lot of champions that would see play if you could fit in those third wheels. And I guess, like, is this something that, you know, the team is thinking about and considering like solutions to this? Like, is it possible there could be, I don't know, 8 champ slots, or possibly like lowering the amount of maximums, or like, I don't know, like what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for what is our current like environment, we're definitely I don't think know if we're exploring anything beyond that, but I think the problem case there is very true. Of like we have a bunch of things that are, you know, at least for competitive decks, and I will call it that, like this is something that's a little more prevalent for competitive decks. If you're just wanting to like have a good time, or you're playing normals, or you're just playing with your friends, like a lot of those champions are for the most part good enough that you don't that's okay, right? Because you're opting into the, I don't know, Rumble Tom Kench deck or something. Don't build that deck. But for competitive decks, yeah, we are very much running into like efficiency matters a ton, and like the like card slot economy is pretty competitive.
Yeah.
And again, not to like answer the problem for future us, but something like a rotation helps with that a lot, because it basically just depowers everything. And it wouldn't surprise me if, when we go to look at like, hey, what is the, you know, what are the additional formats or whatever it is that comes along with rotation, that we at least consider that as a potential like way for us to go about it, or as a something to consider, because like, yeah, champions are important. TLDR, it's a bunch of future stuff that maybe we solve it or we don't.
Oh, okay.
So
No, I mean, if it ends up somehow being built into like some kind of, I mean, rotations. I'm so curious, like, if there's a way to make, because obviously rotations can mean so many different things. I see people in chat saying like, I don't want rotations, but that's because they're thinking of like a specific kind, right? Like the way Hearthstone and Magic do them, I think have definitely like flaws to them, and you know, I mean, what you were saying, in part, I surmised was like, you know, Magic and Hearthstone are much more expensive games, right? So like there are kind of reasons maybe that they do rotations in that way that maybe Runeterra doesn't have to do. But it does feel it you know, the game is so champion oriented, right? Because a large part of the player base is just like League players that like want to be able to interface with their favorite champions in different ways. And it's hard to like restrict the idea of, you know, potentially like changing when you can use champions or where. I mean, that's just, there's no question attached to this. I'm just like thinking in my head, like, what could that look like? You know, how could that be pulled off? I'd be very, very, very interested in seeing that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, to be clear, like when we talk about rotation, because this is also something that we talked about when we were in development of like, you know, a long time ago, like, hey, what are we going to do? Like we always kind of look at it as a scale of on like, I guess I don't know where my hands are. But like on the left hand side, we have full card rotation, which is just like everything goes. It's a fire sale, like nothing remains. We scorch the earth and then we build everything up over again.
Right.
And on the other end of that, on the other far end of that is, we won't rotate anything. What we will do is the power level of each new set we release is so high or so synergistic that while you could play your old cards, the ability to feel like you can be competitive with them is like it's just not possible. That's like the the 0.5 design of like your first set comes out, it's a 1, your second set comes out, it's a 1.5, your third set comes out, it's like a 2, and so you're kind of always just
Right.
buying whatever the new hotness is.
Power creep.
And both of those, yeah, it's just like straight power creep. And there's value and totally valid reasons to do either one of those.
Sure.
We are likely going to be looking somewhere not on those extremes,
Yeah.
because I don't think that our design philosophy doesn't require us to just do straight power creep or just do a full hard rotation. Like we do have some flexibility, and champions are very much a kind of pretty core part of that as well.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. I don't really like either of those extremes either, if I'm being honest. But yeah, no, that's amazing. And so as we get, I think like I pretty much only have like one more topic that I wanted to get in here, which is like this idea of I guess like how to put it, like consumptive play patterns, like ways of just kind of like not really like, so a strategy that's built on the principle of not allowing your opponent to execute their strategy, right? And this is something that happens a lot in Legends of Runeterra, which is like it's a very reactive game, a lot of passing, a lot of just like waiting to see what the opponent does first so that you can counter it at higher levels, of course. And we see a lot of like the top decks are kind of like executing this, and it feels like that has increased, at least not like necessarily like linearly, but broadly it has increased over the last couple of years as well. I mean, how is this somewhat of a concern of just like this idea of like not really letting the opponent be able to like play their game plan, or are like do you feel like that's like overstated?
No, I think you're right. Like our uh consumptive strategies generally want to be like, we can have like a little bit of them in each release or whatever.
Yeah.
But if we have too much, then yeah, the game basically kind of creates a state like that. And essentially that's kind of what happened, is like each set has like one or two consumptive strategies. A lot of the times because consumptive strategies also feel really good or feel really cool when you
Yeah.
pull them off.
Yeah,
Like
for
they
sure.
have some of the highest highs. Yeah, control, or even just like other play patterns, but like when you get to do that thing, it feels awesome. Or if they're not directly consumptive, they are like consumptive adjacent. And it is a kind of like a pretty consistent battle that we have to fight. Our game is much more reactive. It is much more tempo based. And so that's kind of like the thing we sign up for when we're looking at designing archetypes and cards, is like we need to, that is like usually a larger question, or like probably one of the first things that comes up when looking at a new archetype is like, yeah, this looks pretty consumptive. What are we doing about that? Or is it okay? Is it consumptive in at least a way that we can build in some productive strategies? Because like productive is kind of the other way we would phrase that. And so it is very much a thing on our mind. And I would say part of the reason why it is pretty rough right now is our reactive cards and strategies are just pound for pound more effective than kind of like proactive.
Yeah.
And we need to, or my general thought here is like that is a very big space for us to kind of like work on and improve. And I think that's like as we've been kind of going through planning for the next year in terms of like patches and things, that is like probably one of the things that's like generally at the top of the list when we're looking at what cards are we going to touch or what are the themes. And so it's, yeah, we gotta kind of like figure out what our strategy is for that and start to kind of work on it, or at least chip away at it.
Mm. Yeah. I guess I mean, people in chat are pointing out like Bandle's like very proactive, and like that's true. I was mostly thinking about like pre-Bandle, but yeah, things have shifted a lot in the past like 3 months as well. It's a very like different kind of card game, right? Because I mean, when you compare it to, for example, Teamfight Tactics, which in this case I'll call a card game because it's basically a card game using like little action figures instead. But that's like almost a polar opposite to Legends of Runeterra. It's like all about kind of like building your own strategy. It's very solitary, right? You get to like have this like almost single player, like you're in a lobby with other people, but mostly you're just focusing on your own strategy. Whereas Legends of Runeterra is just like a very deep like one-on-one about kind of like individually like having like this game of games with your opponent, right? Like this overlapping idea of like, okay, you counter me, I counter you, right? And I do like that. You know, it's good to go for a very different thing. But I do think there's also like something to the idea of just like a little bit more execution of strategy. It is specifically in that it feels like, you know, there's a lot of things that shut down the opponent's strategies in ways that kind of like feel a little bit. I guess I was talking about you know, stuff like freezes and stuff like chump blocking, like ways of shutting down that feel a little bit bad on average compared to, you know, how things have gone with like more killing units and stuff like that. And just like when you have a deck in Runeterra that wants to be able to execute its own game plan, it feels a little bit rare for that to actually like pay off, I guess, right? And you can see this in like tutor design as well. There's not really a lot of tutors, like a lot of game plans aren't really designed to be consistent. Is this like, I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Let's see. Let me break this down. I'll start with tutors because I think that is probably one that's very, very useful. Yeah, tutors are, I think, pretty dangerous in our game. On average, you know, most of if you have a coherent deck, your average draw is going to be probably more live than not live. Like you very rare, like unless you have very specific tech cards, you know, most of your cards are not going to be completely dead. And so uh, the quality of your hand is just much higher. So like when we print a tutor or a direct tutor, it's actually extremely powerful because it's not like, okay, I tutor up that one piece and now I need to like get the rest of my game plan. Is like you probably already have some number of those cards already to go. And so we kind of have to make them not we have to be very careful about making sure that we're not printing 1-for-1 tutors or tutors that like get you the exact problem every time. Yeah. Trying to think of like a better way you know, to phrase some of that other stuff. When it comes to kind of like I think what you're saying, like solitaire, on the team, we'll usually call this is like, you know, do we have like two ships passing in the night kind of situation, which is like, I'm doing my strategy, you're doing your strategy. We will never interact. And it's just like, we just go past each other and then whoever wins, whoever does their thing, you know, more efficiently wins. Yeah, those are our types of designs that we, or strategies that we're pretty careful of, or we're trying to be more aware of. I think we've had some issues with these in the past where, and I think I was talking to like with Nick about this, where we have some cards in the game or strategies in the game where they kind of break one of the fundamental interaction points of the game of like, in the way I kind of described is like, if I'm able to win the game in a way where you feel like you could interact with me or you should be able to interact with me, but you can't, that's like a big red flag for us. And we are trying to be, it's something that like, you know, we want to make sure are kind of tamped down or we're not enabling those. Breaking the game should feel cool. But when it's like, when it's at a degree where your opponent like never had a real ability to do anything about it, or it feels like they did and they can't, is probably the worst example of that. You know, those are things that like we need to be just better at kind of like solving for, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So yeah, no, it would go like basically completely against LOR's design philosophy to have these kinds of like solitaire things, right? It's like it's a game about just deep interaction more than anything else, right? And kind of like that's built into all of its systems, including like, you know, spell mana and passing. That's like it's really interesting to know because honestly, that's something that I've kind of been curious about. Like as LOR has grown over the past like 2 years, I've, you know, people that have played it have been able to see more and more of like what the like core concept is meant to be long term. And yeah, no, I do like that as like a singular thing that is building towards. I wanted to mention something. So, you know, I went through all my topics just as a final point. I had a random idea. Yeah.
Hit me.
Yeah. I mean, maybe this is good, maybe not. It was just something random I was thinking of the other day, but along the lines of, you know, people want to be able to see their strategies execute, and there's, you know, it's a game that's kind of like deep on like disabling and interactivity. Random idea I was thinking of, just a little bit of a nudge in that direction, is what if wouldn't have to be a gameplay change, but what if when the opponent concedes, you don't see the concede right away. Instead, what you see on the client is basically, you know, an effective, just a series of passes before a surrender, a few actions, or it could be timed. It could be like 20 seconds later, right? So like in a situation where you're about to like execute a combo, you can like, you get to do your big smash into their face, right? Be able to see that and actually have that payoff before the actual disconnect goes through. It's just like a cute little idea that might enjoy, that the players might be able to enjoy more.
Yeah, this is actually so there's one thing I'll bring up beforehand, because I know I don't want this to be like a sound clip or weaponized against other people or me. In terms of like the solitaire strats, we definitely can have them in the game, but there's a like kind of like a hard limit on how many we can have. It's a spice. If it ever becomes like
for sure
the mainstay, then that's a problem. But every once in a while, it's okay to have. So to your thing, that is actually something we had a lot of conversations about before
Seriously?
going live.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is like a well treaded topic. We had design specs on it. If I remember correctly, the reasons that we didn't go forward with it at the time was we were trying to ship the game and it was like a non-essential feature. And I believe there was also some technical concerns around it. I don't remember specifically what they were, but there was like a little bit of a hitch for some extra design.
It's always
or engineering time
stuff.
Yeah, there's a little bit of engineering stuff. I think from the design end, the bigger questions were like, well, does this only detect when like basically lethal is on the stack? Or is this like, does it do it for the entire round? Like basically, when does the AI take over and how does the AI take over?
Yeah.
I think that was one of the larger kind of like things we had to figure out. And then secondarily, there's a weird thing when it comes to our game where we have two audiences essentially. There's the audience that you're kind of speaking about right now is like, hey, I just spent this whole game doing this really cool thing, and you need to stay in this game so I can do it. Like, I want to see the big explosions. I want to see the confetti and the party hats come down. Like let me have that. How dare you leave the game? And there's the other half of our players that are just like, I want, just get me out of this game as quickly as possible. Why are you making me watch these animations? I don't care. Like, just get me out. I want to get into my next game like as soon as humanly possible.
Sure.
And I think we actually helped with that group a little bit. Like, there's that finish button that shows up on screen now, where like, as like lethal's kind of already been hit and stuff's still going, you can hit finish and it kind of like ejects you out of the game quickly. But yeah, that's kind of where that ended. It's definitely something I can bring up again, and I'm actually happy to bring up to like our gameplay team around like, hey, whatever happened with this? Is this more feasible now? And see, I suspect this is very much one of those things where it's like, priority wise, don't know where it would fall, because like, resources matter. But I think it's a very cool thing, and I agree with you of like, yeah, our game in a lot of ways is about the feel good moment of like when you did the thing that you built your entire deck around, and it kind of sucks to not only get to see that one out of every 3 or 4 or 5 times that you actually complete the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it wouldn't probably even take that much on average. Like, I'm just imagining like a lot of the times the surrenders come down like when you're literally like your units are dragged into the attack and the opponent checks the eye. Like, part of this is because of the Oracle's Eye, right? Like in games like Hearthstone, you don't have the Oracle's Eye. But part of it is like they check the eye so they know it's over, so they just like surrender, and just like letting it linger just a few seconds. Like, they're already out of the game, they're queuing for the next game, but you just get to see the payoff, you get to feel the payoff. I don't know, I mean, that would do it for me, man. I will say here an additional thing, you could just get Neil, ring up Neil, makes the emotes. They throw out a Shen emote, they're disconnected, they're queuing for the next game, but like, instead of just like seeing the surrender, they throw out a little Shen emote like before they surrender, before you see it go through, like increase positivity in the community, make people think that, everyone's just very politely GGing you,
Yeah, it's a subtle way to improve the emote, or change up the emote game. And also, poor Neil, I'm sure he's in a high messages on Slack right now, being like, "What have you done? All of these people are yelling at me." Although it would probably be better if Neil did it, because if it was me, I'd probably just have it do like the Braum wave for
the Braum wave. I mean, you want to make it realistic. Definitely have some of them do the Braum wave. I mean, that's all Neo, right? Make it a little variable. Sometimes the occasional Tom Kench hat tip. That'd be
it's just max chaos. Really, that's what I live for. But I think this is a completely reasonable and I think it's a cool thing. As always, the tough part is just like, hey, if we can do it, when can we do it?
Sure. No, absolutely.
And like, what's the execution? But
Well, I mean, that's pretty much everything I wanted to go through, you know. All right, everyone, show a big appreciation to Alexz Lee, Deadbuilt Doris, of course, coming in and you know, sharing with us a little bit of his time and a lot of the insights as to, you know, where everything is at in the game. Huge props, man. I really appreciate it, and the community, as you can see, really appreciates it too.
Oh yeah, thanks again for having me on.
Of course. All right, I'll see you later, man.
Later.
All right. Okay, and that was it. That was very, very clean. All right, guys. So as you can see clearly here, I am half the screen right now. I've lost my other half. This was my solution at the time to the fact that I couldn't figure out how to do a side-by-side call, so I just made myself big and made himself half. Hello, this is even more me, and I just keep going this way too. Like, yeah, no, it's it was a little scuffed. I liked how the stream just crashed halfway through. That was probably my favorite part of it. Yeah, no, I mean, it's actually December of 2021. It's December 15th. And I thought you guys should know that we are about 1 week off.
Judgment card.
We are about 1 week off for my 5-year anniversary as a professional streamer. If it wasn't clear from you know, how professionally I handled everything today, streaming wise, you know. So yeah, no, that's coming up. Pog, yeah? No. No, I'm pretty professional about it. You know, I'm pretty good at asking questions. I don't know if you guys saw some of those like sick question ask no scopes that I pulled out there. You know, a lot of like 40-second word salads. Yeah, I think I outdid myself this time. That was even better than the Dovagitas one. Thanks for understanding, guys. You know, I appreciate it. Better job on the ending this time. I will say I ended that cleanly. I said, like, I did dude, I'm so bad at ending human interactions. I'm good at every part of human interactions except for the very end. Like, I start the call, I come out strong, you know, it's like, hey, nice to meet you. Hello, I'm person. And then, but like, you know, I can keep it through most of it, but every time at the end of a call or the end of any interchange in any sort of like human capacity, I f***ed up. I'm really, really awkward at ending things.